I would like to introduce a few of the web which might not be familiar to everybody, and we will kind of use that possibility today to set the scene for what we then want to do over the next couple of weeks. And I'm not going to go through the exact details of the syllabus, but you can. What I would like to do over the next couple of weeks with you is not just tell you about, what documents are and what the problems are and how to make them accessible and so on and so forth. But we're also trying to maybe have a couple of hands-on sessions where I would like to ask you to actually work with us or work with me, work through examples, look at some tools, play with some tools, give some feedback, and so on and so forth. So for that, in order to facilitate that, what I want to do is that we will put together some sort of a questionnaire, say by the weekend. So you could kind of give us some feedback over Easter. What are your technical experiences? What your personal setup is? Kind of what's your operating system? What's your experience with browsers? Do you use a screen reader? Do you not use a screen reader? And so on and so forth. And so you get some, that you not just take away some knowledge, hopefully, from this lecture, but also some hands-on experience on some of, the tools and systems that are out there. Now, I'm aware of that many in the audience are actually quite expert in the topic already. And so that's why I want to put a couple of disclaimers beforehand, before I even start the lecture. So a general disclaimer is, obviously, we all know this is an evolving topic. None of this is set in stone. As a matter of fact, much of what I'm trying to get across in this lecture is still current research. And consequently, a lot of the techniques that we will be looking at might be subject to change. And we know that in the landscape these days, in particular on the internet and whatnot, things change so quickly that what we learn today might be entirely obsolete by the end of the year. But I'm kind of hoping that at least I'll get some transferable knowledge across. So it will be sufficient that even if the landscape changes, even if everything, all the tools that we're learning this week are no longer available in a month's time, that we can still kind of continue working and apply some of the techniques that we are discussing in this lecture. Right, and then finally, a personal disclaimer. As Paula has pointed out, I'm actually an active researcher in the field, and as such, I have and I should have a vision of the direction of the research field, and therefore I'm very biased. And there's some personal bias which I'm trying to keep out of the lecture as much as possible, but it will not always be possible. So that means the things I say here might have that bias, and therefore they should always be taken with a grain of salt. So other people might see things differently, and that's just the nature of research and nature of discourse. Right. So with all this out of the way, I have to first say that I'm a bit uncomfortable with the format of the lecture. I was hoping that all of this could be in person at some point. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, that's not really the case. Let me just stop sharing the screen for a minute so I can actually look at you, or you can at least look at me. Normally, I would like to look at you, and I would like to have you all in a classroom, and then we can do things as interactive as possible. Now, I appreciate that this is not really possible for obvious reasons. Least of all because the UK currently doesn't even let me out of the country, not even for professional reasons. But what I would like you to do is, as soon as you have questions, is there some way of raising these questions? I see that I'm not overly familiar with Teams. I normally use Zoom, but I see there's a chat button.
No, somebody can raise a hand. I will be monitoring and I will, so what I would suggest is that maybe after 15, 20, 30 minutes, whenever you think that there is a little bit, then we could stop. And whoever has raised their hands, we can ask them to. And if they can come on the video, they can come. Otherwise, they can just raise the audio question.
Right. Okay, so that sounds very good.
So I will tell the person's name, whoever has raised, and they can come back. So please see this on the Teams on the top, the third icon on the top. starting from the left. That's the hand raise button. So you should be able to raise.
Right, brilliant. Okay, let me just I just realized that my slides are gone. Let me give me a second so I can make my slides again. So while I do this, hold on, that should be it. Okay. Well, I'll do this. I'll show you, or I will tell you how my slides actually work. So the slides that you will see, or from which I will be teaching, they do not actually. So they're not slides in the standard sense, as in PowerPoints or a PDF file or something of that nature, but they are all web documents, right? So we will distribute these slides after the lecture, and hopefully you will then be able to work through them entirely on your own, so they're fully standalone, and ideally that should then all work nicely. But for the time being, I'm having problems generating my own slides. There you go. That is not ideal. So now I have them.
One small administrative announcement. All these slides will be available on the Teams. So you can download it. And if there is anyone who has not received the Teams invitation, I think I already had one such email. Because you should all get the Teams invitation, only then you would be able to go to that link and download the slides. So please do send me the email if you're not, because I sent you invitation in 2 ways. One through the creating that my email link. So where we have created this course, all the course alias, where you'd have got the email and you'd have got the email for the same link through the Teams. So you should all get the Teams one, because in future for all other lectures, you'll only get the Teams link.
All right, I managed to make my slide again, and let's start. So what am I going to tell you about today? So today is kind of the more of an introductory lecture to the whole field. And I wanted to introduce in particular some concepts which are important and which will play some role over the next few weeks. And the main concepts obviously are, as the title suggests, documents and accessibility. But I also want to generally talk a bit more about usability and the web. I will first start with an introduction of what usability is in general, what the concept is, what that actually means for software, and for computational artifacts, and then discuss a bit of concepts like universal design and how that fits into accessibility, and how all this fits into documents, and eventually where we want to work with documents. And these days, obviously, we want to work with documents primarily on the web. And hence, I will talk a bit about those, about my view of the web, and some important concepts that need to be understood before we even dive deeper into that. Now, as you probably can imagine, I primarily work with web documents in my research. However, I mean, there's still traditional document formats. We're going to touch on some of these document formats throughout the lecture as well. So today I will just talk about them very briefly, but we will intersperse some accessibility considerations, for instance, for PDF documents at some point in the lecture as well. Right, so let me start with the concept of usability. What is usability actually? And the easiest is always, as we do these days, we start with a Wikipedia definition, right? What is usability according to Wikipedia? I've summarized it here, where it's the capacity of a system to allow users to perform tasks safely, effectively, and efficiently, and while enjoying the experience. right? I mean, we can probably all agree on the first three. Enjoying the experience is not necessarily something everybody would think in the first instance, but obviously, if you want something to be usable, it should help us to achieve something with its functionality, right? That is not all, right? Safely, effectively, and efficiently is not just what that means. So functionality is often very easy to achieve. Making things usable is a lot harder. And I'll walk you through a couple of examples that we have in real life. And I appreciate that some of these are kind of picture heavy. So I'll try to explain those images that I have on my slides to you. So a general usability example, it's a classic example, it's a light switch, right? So what is the purpose of a light switch? Well, you've got to find it and switch on or off some lights. So I've put some pictures down here of light switches. One is kind of a heavy going old one on the left-hand side. Then there's more touch and feel light switches in the middle, which have LED feedback. And there's a couple of hazardous ones, I would call them. Ones which just stick out the box and there's wires around them. And the other one is right next to a power outlet socket, right? It's a European power outlet socket. You wouldn't find that in the UK, I have to say, but in Europe, they do have these things. And that obviously raises the question, well, what the example light switch, in terms of our usability definition, is it safe? And generally it is, unless there's live wires around it or if it's right next to a power outlet, because then you might just get your finger stuck in there at some point when you're trying to grab for it in the middle of the night. Well, that also means the question is it effective? Well, it is effective. It switches on and off the light. If it doesn't, well, clearly it is not effective. And finally, is it efficient? Well, how do you define efficiency for a light switch? One is, can I find it easily? Do I find it where I expect it? So in other words, if I need to find it in the dark, is it easy to find? An efficient light switch is probably something next to a door when I go into the room. An inefficient light switch is something it's a light switch that might be at the opposite end of a hallway where I don't enter the room. So that's kind of efficiency when we talk light switches. Enjoyability, that's difficult to say. What's enjoyable about a light switch? Maybe if there's a dimmer or something on it, then it might be enjoyable. Otherwise, it might not be. But what we see is, in a way, what the usability of a light switch is, well, inserting the switch into a circuit so it can work, so it provides its functionality, is a fairly easy affair. Having it somewhere where it's reachable and safe and operable by anyone is less obvious. So you have to consider, for instance, the light switch. One of the light switches I showed you was one which is very hard going, which is not that easy. For instance, if you don't have the strength, if you have problems with your fingers, rheumatoid arthritis, for instance, or anything of that. If they're too high, they might be hard to reach if you're a small child, or they might be difficult to reach if you're in a wheelchair, and so on and so forth. So there are certain considerations you have to apply in order to make a light switch usable. Now I'll give you a second example, which I titled The Particular Unusability. And that example is about elevator panels. Now, elevator panels, so that means you go into an elevator, you look for the panel, how do I get to the next floor? So my goal is getting to a floor. How can I achieve that with the elevator? Well, I'm looking for the buttons which tell me which floor I need to go to. And there's various ways how to do this. And if you have every floor on a button, so here I have a picture which is about a 50-story building. It's not that easy to actually find the right floor, but since they're at least ordered, you should be able to get there. And there's a couple of buttons you might not really know what they are, and so on and so forth. But in general, you know, that you can imagine that it's fairly functional, that it's fairly efficient. Now, in the middle, I have an image of a panel, an elevator panel, where everything is being given in a as a touch buttons, but at least they're lit up, and so you can if you can see them, you might be able to find them, and they still give you the ground floor, first floor, second floor, and so on. So you can directly dial your floor. Now I'll tell you about a story about another elevator panel, which I'm afraid I don't have a picture of because I can't get into the particular place where that is. And the particular place is the computer science department at the University of Birmingham. Now, the computer science department at the University of Birmingham is a 3-floor building, right? 3 stories, ground floor, first floor, second floor. And it's got a basement, right, where the robotics lab is and some other things. Now, the elevator is really beautiful. It's a pretty beautiful elevator. It's all black. It's all sleek. It's got a fantastic panel. It's a very nice and smooth black panel, which is in the middle of the elevator. It's at a low height, so people with wheelchairs can reach it very easily. The elevator talks to you. It tells you which floor you're on. Are you on the first floor, second floor? Are the doors opening? Are the doors closing? It's all fantastic. There's just one minor flaw. It's so pretty and beautiful that this black panel with the numbers on it is absolutely smooth. That means that if you're blind, you can't feel any of these buttons. You have to poke around as you like, right? Another problem is that we have a 3-story building, but the elevator panel gives you a keypad of 10 keys, 0 to 9, right? And a door closing and a minus sign. And the reason for the minus sign is if you want to go to the basement, you have to actually enter not just basement, you have to enter -1, right? Meaning that this fantastically looking panel is entirely useless if you have a blind person who, first of all, might look for the panel somewhere on their height. Obviously, it's low, which is fine, and then they might actually look for buttons that they know and understand and can push. And since it's so smooth, you can't even put a braille label on it or anything. So this is a concept of what I would call a particular unusability. It's useful for most people, but there will be some people who are excluded, and people just haven't thought about that when they designed the whole thing. Right. Finally, I want to talk about what is general unusability, and I'm sure everybody knows that general unusability, and that's what if you look at your own microwave or a microwave oven that you see somewhere, they're generally quite useless in many ways. I've put a couple of examples there of buttons in front on a microwave panel. Let's face it, at least I admit freely that I have lots of buttons on our microwave or on previous microwave. I never ever used more than 1 or 2. The one is normally the start button and the one where you add quickly some more time. Right? Sometimes you might want to use the defrost button, but who uses buttons for potatoes and pizza reheating and beverages? And there's one which says deodorization. I don't even know what that is. But these are buttons you find. They're probably never used. And in general, quite unusable because people have no idea what they really do. Right? I mean, if we were in a classroom setting, I would now take a straw poll of everyone, whether you have used a microwave, ever used a button which has a particular food sign on it and says, for instance, oh, popcorn. Now you reheat popcorn. Now, I'll give you a second just to maybe give me some feedback, if you like. Raise your hands if you have ever used something, or if you know all the buttons in front of your microwave.
Anyone?
Any takers? Well, I'll take a sip of water. Right. I mean, I know it's not statistically significant, but I'll take that as confirmation of my theory that microwave panels and their usability design is a particularly unusable design.
So, Walker, I will sort of add to this. I recently purchased a new microwave, and the buttons that I want are so hard to find. And as you said, there are lots of other buttons which nobody touches them. So.
Exactly, entirely useless. I mean. Well, but somebody must have thought up these things. I'm just always stunned that they're not going out of fashion. there's probably a school of thought out there that says we can sell more microwaves the more buttons they display, because they tend to suggest functionality that it clearly isn't there. Anyway, so let me just sum up this, and let's go more. Let's carry on and get more into the realm of electronics and software. What I tried to demonstrate with these examples is that usability for one is not necessarily usability for another, right? So in other words, usability for one might need unusability for another. If my button is not in the right place, it might not be useful. A classic example is always example of toilet design. Let's face it, toilet design is if there's a disabled toilet in the house, that's more than enough, right? One toilet, it has to be for disabled, which does not necessarily help people who can't really see, because they rather need a small cubicle. At least that's what my colleagues at Google always told me. So in other words, what we need is some sort of general principle how we can design something for everybody, and that's normally called universal design. And a particular aspect of all this is of course caring for accessibility, but not just for accessibility, but in many ways thinking about every possible user that your product might touch in its lifetime. And that means it's regardless of their age, special needs, or disabilities, or abilities. Right, so in other words, we want to design for things that is usable for users also with special needs. And when we say special needs, we mean things like, okay, well, visual needs, oral needs, blindness, deafness, but also movement limitations, people in wheelchairs, limited use of extremities, and so on and so forth. Cognitive disabilities, when we say dyslexia, dyscalculia, and so on, that's in many ways on the rise. I think in the UK, it's now estimated that about of our students' population, about 20% have some form of cognitive disability, learning disability of dyslexia or dyscalculia kind. Dyspraxia, but also that all of these disabilities are not really disability just in the sense that somebody has them and that's it, but they also are impairments that affect all of us at some point in our life, right? Even visual disabilities, we all become visually disabled quite quickly when we move from a dark room into a very bright space. And if glare is on a screen and so on, if our hearing is distracted, if the car goes by, if the horns are blaring in the street, all this kind of is very similar to hard of hearing. Movement, of course, we all need. There's always a point where we can only have one hand free and so on. We might be distracted and so forth. So our memory doesn't work as well as it should be. So that's a temporal cognitive disability. And for all this, in many ways, it's good to cater for, and it has to be catered for. And it also particularly has to be catered for when we talk software artifacts and computational devices, right? So because then it is even more important than before. Traditionally, if you could think about traditionally, the idea of usability was always, well, equated in many ways with accessibility, right? I mean, of course, it's inconvenient if the light switch is not right next to the door at your height, but you can make do if you're fully able, right? You will be able to find it, right? If you're disabled, then you have a hard time, and it has to be catered for that case especially. In software, this is not the case. In software, it is important for everybody. Usability is important because what do you want a software artifact to be? You want it to be effective. That means, does it actually do what I want it to do? It also has to be efficient in a way telling me that, can I get to the task in a reasonable amount of time? Or how long does it actually take me to get there? And it should be enjoyable, let's face it, because, you know, the days are over with software developers could just force a particular product on you and you would have to use it because that was the only Office suite available out there. Let's face it, we all know what you were talking about. But these days, you know, everybody has a little app and you can always just delete it and get a new one and so on. So it really has to be enjoyable for the user as well. The user experience has to be good. And finally, is it safe? Well, in terms of safety, you often think about software viruses, but what it also means is how severe is it that if we make a mistake? If I make a mistake and all my work over the last 3 hours is gone because there's no undo button and because there is no safety catch and there is no automatic backup, then it's not a good piece of software. And there's a couple of additional aspects which normally don't come into play in everyday usability. Well, maybe when it comes to the microwave and all its different buttons. And that's learnability and memorability. So that are effectively concepts of how difficult is it for a new user or to learn a piece of software or a piece of computational artifact or a piece of app where they have to do a task. How difficult is it to do it if you do it for the first time? And then the concept of memorability also comes into play, where you say, well, do I have to relearn the task every time I go to that app? Do I stand in front of it every time? What on earth do I have to do again? How do I work this thing? It's important that if you've learned it once, that you don't easily forget it, and then you kind of can recall quite quickly what you have to do in a particular system. Right? That is really important these days, and that's what effective usability is all about. And there's a couple of important bits and particular misconceptions that people always throw out there when they don't really want to think about these issues. So first of all, well, you know, what's important for usability is the concept of it has to look good. Now that's about the worst possible design idea you could have, because design does not necessarily equal aesthetics. And classic example is that in the late 90s, there was a trend for web designers in particular to get everything into pretty images. So instead of having mere text on a website, which you could read and which you could click on and which you could ultimately make accessible, what people wanted to do was, oh, well, I just, you know, I have this fantastic background image and into this, I want to float the information. So therefore, I put all the text into that image. And in that image, I then put some underlaid with some areas where I can click on. So it simulates like I have links. But that, of course, means that all of a sudden everything is just encoded in pixels with no way to make it accessible, no way to give it, say, to a screen reader to read it out loud to somebody. And all of a sudden, you know, design and aesthetics took over. And unfortunately, it was entirely unusable. Usability has nothing to do with looks. Looks are fine and important. That's for the enjoyability often, but it's not really the end all and the be all and end all. Another common misconception is that usability cannot be measured. It's something purely it's not something purely subjective, which isn't true. There's plenty of ways how to measure usability. One I've put on the slides here, though, that's what's called Fitts' law, and that Fitts' law describes the average time it takes to complete a task with a point-and-click device. This is actually, you know, you can imagine it's a quite standardized mathematical idea. You need to go from point A in your on your screen to point B, and clearly there's a direct way how to move your mouse across or whatever point and click device you're using, and therefore there's also a way how to compute exactly how long it takes and what the time for that is. Unfortunately, and this is an important thing, important note is that you can measure that quite clearly for a point and click device. You can't measure it quite as clearly for a keyboard substitute. Right? If you, instead of having to go from point A to point B, instead of going with the mouse there, you go there with your keyboard because you can't use a mouse, because you can't see where the pointer is. That measure is different, and it's less obvious to record. Final misconception which people normally throw at you is, well, but usability considerations are expensive. Usability testing is expensive, and that is in many ways true. What is not...
Audio was gone. Okay.
Does it work again? Am I back?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. Maybe I was moving around too much in my chair. Sorry. So thank goodness you can only see my slides and not me moving around. So the question of, is usability expensive? Yes, usability testing is expensive because you have to hire experts. You have to actually talk to users, which always costs money. But on the other, on the upside or on the downside is, if you don't do it, you start maintaining a poor design, and that's even a lot more expensive. You start losing users, which means you lose customers, and ultimately you might, particularly if you're a big company, you might get sued, and that costs money. So the conclusion, of course, is designing for everyone is important. Right. And designing for everyone is normally a process or a product, depending on how you see it, which is called universal design. The idea of universal design is that you have a design that is usable for all people. While this is not always possible, you at least try to design or find a design that works for as many people as possible. And I said that this universal design is a product, i.e. the design that's the result, but it's also a process, meaning that you actually go through steps in order to make this happen, in order to improve your design to an extent where you can reach a wide audience. And the idea is also that it's designed as a singleton entity. The idea is always you try to have one thing that works for everybody rather than something that needs a lot of additional special cases, add-ons, or extra layers. And that's particularly important when you talk about software design, where you have to consider a lot of things. You don't just have to consider what the functionality of a product is, but also what's input, what's output, how is it being presented, what's the interaction a person or a user might need to take, what's the general workflow of a user or a walk through a particular use case in your system. And so the things you primarily have to consider are things like input. What's the traditional input things are things like keyboards and keypads and panels, point and click devices like mice, trackballs or pens, touch-based devices. Think about mobile devices, laptops, smart boards, and all these things. These are common input devices, and most people care for them. There's less common ones, which obviously have to do with, say, voice recognition for microphones. You might have a data glove. Becomes more and more frequent now in virtual reality situations. Other things which people often don't even consider input devices are things like eye tracking devices or breathing tubes. If you're paraplegic, for instance, you can't really use your hands, you can't really use your feet, or you can use your eyes or your breath. And even if you consider all these input devices, what's hard about thinking about input when you design something is, well, how do they all combine? In particular, what if one of these is not available? Can I substitute it with another? And that gets us effectively back to this Fitts law, which I was talking about earlier, where they, okay, well, if we are aware that the user can use the mouse across the screen, this is going to be a great user experience. If they have to tap with their keyboard 200 times just to get to the same place, it's a bad user experience. And so you have to think about what is the trade-off. And it's easier to think about other things like to think about output devices instead. Output obviously is not just thinking about, well, can it be drawn on something visually on a screen, on a printer, but also can it be output by sound? If you can't see it, you need to hear it. And also things like, common output devices, of course, data that goes to the network, might go to a memory stick, might go somewhere else. How can I deal with this? But that's not really something we're too interested in. So I'm not going to go into detail. I'd rather think about more other things that we also might will touch upon in this lecture, other outputs forms, primarily things like braille displays and embossers, tactile output, but also things like haptic output is interesting these days. You might have a force feedback joystick, which used to be great for gaming. Now you might want to use it for something else, etc. And the question is, of course, always, is there some way that we can support all of these at once? And how do all these things actually fit together? Well, ultimately, they all have to fit together by some sort of intrinsic logic, which binds them together in a functional system, and a functional system that actually works for everybody as much as possible for ideally all input and all output sides of the things. Workflows have to be influenced not just by their functionality, but also by the users they might use them. So is it a novice? Is it an expert? Are people tech savvy? Can they understand what I'm talking about? And that then ultimately also means, what is the presentation of what I give people, right? And the presentation, if you think about it, it changes every day. If you look at your mobile phone, every day you get a different presentation of what you have. So just as an example, right? In the olden days, we used to have a single line input. That was easy. But then we started having widgets and windows and the menus, which ultimately changed to smart icons, which you had to learn. And then you would look at lists of files or directories. Nowadays, everything comes in tabs and buttons. It's even worse. You've got what's called the mystery meat of mobile navigation. Let me just switch that on. That is by Luke Wroblewski, who's a designer in the Silicon Valley. So here's just a little overview of all the menus you now have to understand. So everybody probably has seen hamburger menus before, right? Those are the three little buttons or bars at the very top of your screen. Often there's kebab menus, the way they are being presented. Meatballs are going sideways. Pinto menus are kind of the ones where you know that you have multiple selections and so on and so forth. And they change on a daily basis. Right? And the big question is always, who can remember that? And do they really help? Let me have a quick...
It's a time to take a little break.
We should take a little break.
So I think, is there any questions, please?
Right. So let me just quickly summarize what I've went through the main process of universal design. When I'm now after the break, we'll take a little break. After the break, I'll summarize some more of the universal design, give a couple of general approaches to it, with examples of good and bad, and then we'll zoom into what this means for documents and why we're even talking about all these design ideas while we want to talk about accessible documents, and then I will introduce you to my view and kind of what is often the common view of what the web is and how documents on the web work. Do we reconvene in 5 minutes? Is that about the right time, or?
Yeah, I will try to find the microwave button to heat up my coffee and then.
Yes, and you should find the right button as well. That's important.
Yeah. So 5 minutes, we will all jump.
So.